Well, thank you, Dr. Didway, for the warm introduction and, of course, this opportunity to share with those who are gathered in and around this subject of intergenerational preaching. It's a passion area of mine and something I was thrust into unwittingly because of the timing of my birth. And so, for some in this room, in fact, for all of us in this room, we generally preach to 4 or 5 generations in any given service. If you are a part of an established church, especially a church that is not a plant, chances are you are preaching to 4 or 5 generations as the builders progress and pass away, and boomers become the retired community of our church. You have a small section of persons in your church who are Generation X, and then, of course, those very, very, very troubled and troubling millennials. And then the emerging group is Generation Z, who are entering adulthood. And the truth is, each of these groups is in desperate need of the gospel. And so how do we tailor our time and the limited attention span that we have to work with, our sermons, to meet the needs of persons in all of those generations? That's the intent of our talk and our time, and I pray that it's helpful and fruitful. I'd like to start the time with kind of a biblical underpinning. 2 Timothy 4 and then 1 Corinthians 9 as a bit of a foundational premise for the overarching talk that we'll have today. And so 2 Timothy 4, and you all are preachers and students and faculty, and so I dare not insult your intelligence. But there is an exhortation from Paul as he's going off the scene to his son in the faith, Timothy, chapter 4, verse 1. I charge you in the presence of God and Christ Jesus, who is the judge of the living and the dead, and by his appearing and his kingdom. Verse 2 says, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. The ellipsis of the remaining part of that exhortation: in season and out of season. It feels as though preaching is out of season. The increase in, we've gone from the idea of relative truth to the idea that we're outright liars. So there was a period, a brief period, I think, in social history where the idea of relative truth that we were so upset about. You know, we are people of absolute truth, fundamental truth, baseline truth. And then there was a period of relative truth where people said, well, that truth works for you, but it may not work for everyone. And we were upset. And many of us are still fighting against that idea of relative truth. But we've gone from our notion of absolute truth to the culture's notion of relative truth to now absolute truth on the other end, which is our sense of absolute truth is a lie. It feels like preaching is out of season. We're not as trusted, as celebrated, as venerated, as believed. We are fact-checked in real time during our sermons. Google is given as much credence, if not more, than those of us who spend our lives and hours and have advanced degrees in the things that we speak about on Sunday and in other contexts of ministry. It feels like preaching is out of season. However, perhaps preaching is actually in season. So Warren Buffett is the Wizard of Wall Street, and in the economic downturn of 2008 with the crash and crisis and such, Warren Buffett began to flood the market with millions of dollars into sinking stocks. And he was interviewed and asked about this seemingly very foolish financial move that he was making. Why would you flood the market, sinking stocks with millions of dollars? And so Buffett said, well, the best time to invest is when the market is low, because it gives the greatest potential for return. And so the worst condition of the culture is probably the best environment for preaching. But we cannot approach it with the models and the mentality of yesterday. And as we venerate those who've come before us, we must venerate them rightly, but not always imitate them directly. So, intergenerational preaching. I think Paul helps us with this in 1 Corinthians 9. This is one of my, whenever I have the opportunity to talk to pastors and preachers, this is one of the bases for the conversation that I'd like to have with those of us who do ministry for a living. In 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 19, Paul says this, "For though I am free from all, I've made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings." Just take note of the intent, and as Paul describes his ministry there, the intent. What's remedial exegesis, and I hate to insult your intelligence, but what's repeated in this text over and over again? All, that superlative. And my father used to have a assistant pastor named Richard Carthorne, who would say the Greek word for all translates to all. Listen to him again. "For though I am free from all," in verse 19, "I've made myself a servant to all," in verse 19. All and all. And then again in verse 22, "I have become all things to all people, that by all means," all. Then there's the win. That's repeated. What I'm trying to do is win. To the Jews in verse 20, I became as a Jew to win those under the law, that I might win those under the law. Those outside the law, as one outside the law, though not myself being outside the law, to win. I want to win. So I become all so that I can win. I become all so I can win. All to win. This should be our attitude. It is a whatever it takes attitude. All means serving all, understanding that we'll only save some, but all until we can get the sum. He says, "I do it all for the sake of the gospel." What this means is that we must live in ministerial flexibility. So the preacher cannot be rigid or stuck. Intergenerational preaching to the 3, the 4, the 5 generations in any given context requires ministerial flexibility. I have to train my voice to be in tune with the ear of the generations in my church. So that what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 9 is that biblical fidelity, gospel fidelity, requires cultural awareness and sensitivity. I am not faithful to the gospel if I am ignorant of the culture of those to whom I'm preaching. I do not bring them into my culture. I am to be flexible enough to reach them in theirs. And so the generations are varied, they're vast. Millennials and Z are institutional averse. They are averse to institutions just on their face. And so government, church, school, they are averse to anything institutional. If it's institutional, it's wrong. It's not just something, it's not a place of suspicion, it's a place of distrust, inherent distrust for institutions. Therefore, inherent distrust of the guardians and the proponents of those institutions. You and I stand as essentially untrustworthy figures because we are the guardians and proponents of the institution that they perceive to be the church. Now, we've got to split the hair for them and say that what you have grown up seeing as the church, or what media portrays church to be, is not the true church of the Lord Jesus Christ. The church of the Lord Jesus Christ is not an institution, it is a community. And what we're inviting you to is not to continue to perpetuate an institution. We're inviting you to participate in a community that develops spiritual growth and Christ-likeness. And so that's what has to be explained. But those institutional things that are near and dear to most of us are the things that cause millennials and Z to automatically turn us off and to be a negative audience. Whereas, from the builder to the boomer to even those of us who are Generation X, institution is just fine for us. And in fact, speaking to our souls requires what Haddon Robinson would call the ring of the familiar. There must be, in some way, some familiarity within the presentation, something that we connect to, that we associate with the institution of church. And so my sermon must at once affirm the historical church, but correct its errant practices. Does that make sense? So I have to affirm, builder, boomer, Xer, that you have not wasted these 50 years of your life participating in this institution. And yet, millennial and Z, there are great weaknesses and tragedies and things that have been perpetuated by church as institution rather than church as community that we must outright reject. It requires flexibility. Gospel fidelity includes cultural awareness. Let me give you another piece of intergenerational preaching. From here on out, I want to be exceedingly practical. I've taught this in other settings, including my friend Ricardo Smith is here at his Classic City Conference. If you can make it to Athens, Georgia in January, I highly commend his conference. It's a great work that he's doing there. It's important intergenerationally that you are able to know the numbers in your church, which means a hard statistical analysis of your congregation and community. A hard statistical analysis of your congregation and community. Anecdotal evidence is not sufficient to help you design sermon and series to build your congregation, to reach all of the generations in your congregation, to reach all of the generations in your community. There will always be an outlier. There will always be a baby boomer who loves when you preach to and about and like a millennial. And there'll always be a Generation Zer who's just an old soul who loves the hymns and loves stained glass windows and padded pews. But you cannot affirm the totality of your preaching ministry because, oh, I've got a couple of young people that like the old stuff. Or I got a couple of older people who like the young stuff. The anecdotal evidence does not give you enough to secure the sense that you are meeting the needs of all the generations. They might just be outliers within their generation. So you need a body of evidence beyond the few handful of testimonies, because here's what people generally do. People are generally going to speak to you of their own volition, their own accord, positively about sermon and ministry. People will say things about you they don't say to you. And so you have to create means to measure the impact of sermon, the impact of a series, the impact of ministry beyond those who are already inclined to offer a positive, encouraging opinion about them. So how do we do that? We got to know the numbers. We have to know the ages of the persons in our congregation. We have to know, if possible, the income levels, perhaps not what each individual makes, but mean income, educational levels, socioeconomic realities. Who is the principal of your closest elementary school? Do you know them? Do you take them to lunch? Do you have conversations with them? What do those families need? Your local high school. What's the suspension rate in your high school? Do you know that? What's the suspension rate? What are the elementary kids reading on grade level? These are important realities because they don't just shape the missions and outreach of your church, they should be shaping the sermons you preach as well. Because if it's only shaping the social aspect, the outreach, the mission, and I'm assuming you're using these things to shape your missions, but if you're not, they should be shaping the missions of your church. Let me put in what a term I learned in in Arkansas is Ben Warner. Y'all know what a Ben Warner is? It's something I Ben want to say. So let me put in a Ben Warner right here. I think it's absolutely egregious that the Church of the West spends hundreds of thousands of dollars in its budget to do missions thousands of miles away when those resources can and should also be used to do missions in and around that community and city. And so for those who celebrate and venerate that there's a work being done in Haiti or in Zimbabwe or in Papua New Guinea, yes, please, praise the Lord for that. But if they are getting the benefit of your missional giving and your local community is not, I think you have an upside down sense of the call and the gospel. So it should shape that. You should know these things, your social factors in your city, your community, to shape those things, but it should also shape your preaching. It should shape your preaching. Shaping interpretation requires right biblical exegesis. Shaping application requires right cultural exegesis. So interpretively, we must interpret the Bible using right, responsible, biblical interpretation, exegesis. But applicationally, cultural awareness is required, and cultural awareness involves knowing the hard numbers. Knowing the hard numbers. I'll give you an example from St. Mark. I got there 7 years ago. I pastored in the D.C. area, Maryland, and Virginia for 10 years prior to going to Little Rock. I got to Little Rock, and St. Mark had a plan and an expectation to build a new worship center. So St. Mark boasted a certain number in terms of its membership, and it was a very proud church of its size and significance. And so we're going to build a worship center. We're going to build big old church. Build us a church. We're going to build us a church. And I got there and did this hard statistical analysis. Who's in our church? Who's in our community? What does the school district look like? And there were 25,000 students in the Little Rock School District, and there were 10,000 suspensions a year. 4,000 of them were repeat offenders. And so what is a 2,500-seat sanctuary going to do for kids who are suspended? The minimum suspension was 5 days. Second offense, 7 days. Third was 10 days within a semester. Kids were missing sometimes 22 days. And you're not catching up. I don't care who you are. You're not catching up in math or reading or social studies or any of those subjects if you're out 5 and then 7 and then 10 days. And so, since you all want to be this great church and with all of this great influence, then we're going to have to course correct. And rather than build something we can use twice a week, maybe on Sundays and Wednesdays, we need to build something we can use every day, that those who are in our community, those who are suspended, marginalized, they need a place they can come. We established a program called Reclaiming Scholars. So rather than building a sanctuary, we built a youth center, 50,000 square feet youth center that has Reclaiming Scholars in it, that's funded by our school district. Hallelujah, thank you, Lord. Where those kids who are suspended in middle and high school, who are nonviolent offenders, have the opportunity to come to get the behavioral modification they need to make better decisions. We keep them up in school or catch them up in their work, and we do behavioral modification. Do you see my fingers here? We say Jesus in Reclaiming Scholars because it's a private program. We say Jesus. We have a 92% success rate of kids who go back and don't get into trouble again. We have persuasion. But here's the thing. So that was the course correction. That sounds good. Everybody makes sense to you now. But St. Mark said, we don't want to build some of them. We want a church. And so I have to do a series. I have to preach then on, well, what is a church? We want a church. So does Jesus. He wants one also. In fact, he's already building it. Therefore, he gets to direct the affairs of it. And so it shaped not just the ministry of the church, it shaped the preaching of the pastor, me. It worked into a series of sermons that revolutionized our thought process as a church. So you got to know the numbers. You have to know the numbers. What are the genuine needs of the people? So when you think about intergenerational preaching, specifically in terms of application, the gospel is right and true. It needs no revision, no addition, no updating. However, our application grids do. They need revision and updating. There's a group that is a passing generation for whom, as my grandfather would say, they can feel the mists of the Jordan on their faces. And how do we effectively apply the truth of the gospel to those who are closer to seeing Jesus than ever before? And not just that, because we are aware that any of us at any time in the sovereignty of God, there's a point to man wants to die, and after that the judgment. They have a greater sense of it than perhaps most of us do in this room. How do we preach applicationally to that individual? What is the application of my sermon for the person who feels like tomorrow I could wake up in heaven? That boomer is retiring and having to adjust greatly. Boomers, God bless you, those of you who are in this room, I blame you for all the problems in the world. As a Gen Xer with the tug of war between boomers and millennials and Z, I blame boomers because boomers introduced the concept of consumerism en masse to the American Western church. Shame on you with your felt need ministry selves. Shame for shame. But boomers are retiring in large numbers, and the social safety net has holes in it. And so boomers are dealing with a sense of insecurity in and around identity. Many of them are having to go back to work or living on much less than they intended to live on in retirement. Those things that were supposed to be secure, social security, has turned out to be social insecurity. There's the ever-pressing threat of the change to Medicare, Medicaid. Can I go to the doctor? And then a sense of identity as the church keeps trying to figure out what to do to reach, to maintain, to engage the younger generation. Boomers over saying, hey, we helped this thing become what it is. What about us? Where do we fit in this new church movement, as it were? Applicationally, a sense of value, a sense of security, and an increased sense of responsibility. Gen Xers are largely ignored. That's my group. I'm a Gen Xer. We are perhaps one of the most stable generations ever born, but we're the smallest. And so when you pull the numbers, and I think Rayner talks about it in his book on millennials, boomers were the largest generation, and because of their consumer tendencies, they just didn't have as many children. And so Gen Xers are about 56 million or so live births, whereas boomers are in the 80 millions, and millennials are in the, I think the numbers settled in 100 plus million live births. And so Gen Xers are the ones, we stay on jobs. We still buy houses or bought homes. We're paying into Social Security knowing we'll probably never see any of it back. And the economic reality in the state of Arkansas is this, and it may be true in your state. The economic reality is that as Gen Xers who are stable and paying into the social safety net are the managers and presidents and CEOs, the problem is there are more boomers than we can pay for. And millennials aren't helping us because they don't stay on jobs and they don't buy houses. So the things that made economy stable, they are unstable, looking for what's next and what's best. And so Gen Xers are saying, man, I like this Jesus thing. We're in it. We're still in this church, but we feel like there's going to be a few days where we'll be in this church by ourselves. And are there enough of us to keep this thing going? Applicationally, what Gen Xers need more than anything is an exhortation to faithfulness. Because it's hard carrying something when you feel like you're carrying it by yourself. Boomers are there, they're giving, they're participating, but they don't have as much time or energy, and those in retirement don't have as much money. And Xers are saying, I'm here, Pastor. I'm engaged. I'm giving. And yet you keep fussing at the church about where you all at. I'm here. You all aren't giving. I am. You all aren't evangelizing. We do. Xers need faithfulness. Millennials and Z, and we still don't exactly know what all Z is going to be at this point, but millennials, they're not children. They distrust institution. They distrust those who are the protectors and promoters of institution. Millennials believe that attending once a month is active membership. They genuinely do. They sincerely believe that. They also don't know why we need to own a building or own property. Let's just rent something out and meet and then give all the church's money away to needy people and causes. Their sense of community comes from technology. They don't feel connected because they speak to you face to face. They feel connected when they can access you socially on social media. So millennials applicationally need a big bridge built from their concept of community to Christ's concept of community. Because that's a large gap. Z is the most diverse generation heretofore. They are diverse racially and socially. And so our churches need to reflect the diversity of that generation intentionally in order to survive. So how do we design the sermon to hit all of these groups? I hope I'm not boring you too much. How do we design a sermon for these groups so that in the small amount of time that we have, that we can engage them? What does sermon design look like? I don't have to tell you how to do a detailed exegetical process. You have that. You are here in this academic environment. Getting to the point of the passage through your exegetical process is key. We don't need to adjust that. Sermon construction can be varied. Now I want to give you, as it were, what I think are 7 thoughts in and around sermon construction. 7 things to think about as you're writing a sermon that will be intergenerational. Very quickly. Preach expositionally. This may seem to be contradictory, but just stay with me. Expositionally, narratively. Preach socially. Preach authentically. Preach illustratively. Preach doctrinally. And preach succinctly. I'll give them to you again. Expositionally. Narratively. Socially. Authentically, illustratively, doctrinally, succinctly. 7 ideas. Why expositionally? I agree with Dever that expositional preaching is just that the point of the passage is the point of the sermon. I think we were misled to think that exposition was a structure when it really is just an intent. Exposition is an intent, it's not a structure. The structure that we most closely associate with exposition, with an introduction, transition into movements, movements into conclusion, that structure is really a Greek philosophical form of argument. I think we can attribute that to Socrates. And it's an effective form. It works. It's usable. But that's not the only structure that a sermon can have that to make it faithful and expositional. It doesn't have to start with a proposition into a transition, into movements, into a conclusion. It doesn't have to do that. It doesn't have to do so. I want to say it again. It doesn't have to do so. It can, it's good, it's helpful, yes, but it doesn't have to in order to be an expository sermon. Exploring different structures, variety, being unpredictable in the presentation of the sermon is engaging. Furthermore, let me say this. If you disagree with me, do this for me. Preach a series in that traditional structure, and then poll your congregation after it and ask them to identify your theses or your propositions. I'll bet any amount of money they can't do it. Unless you say, this is my proposition today, and put it on your screens or hand it out on a piece of paper. I'm going to say something else. You'll be mad when I tell St. Mark, you'll be all right when the swelling goes down. The structure of the sermon is more for the preacher than it is for the pew. It's more for you so you don't drift and ramble and get off focus than it is for them. Because here's what all of those groups are listening for. What does this have to do with me? Now, you have some Bible nerds who will hang in there, and I'll talk about this in the succinct portion of this. You have some Bible nerds who love all the facts and figures and dates and history and word studies, and you can twist around your exegesis and all of that stuff, and they're like, yes, Pastor, that was great. But I guarantee you the majority of your people are not listening for all of those things. What does this have to do with me? Peter's great sermon on Pentecost, where he very painstakingly walks through Old Testament history to bring the audience at Pentecost to the place where they understand the sign of tongues that they're seeing in Acts chapter 2. And Peter says, this is that which was spoken of by the prophet Joel. And he goes through in David's life and prophetic history, and God has made Jesus Lord and Christ, the one you crucified. And you know what the response is? Men and brethren, what shall we do? What are we supposed to do with this? Exposition is an intent, it's not a structure. It's that the point of the passage is the point of your sermon, as Mark Dever says, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. So from time to time, preacher, maybe let's propose a proposition at the end of a sermon. And as my doctoral mentor, Dr. William H. Curtis, would often say, it's okay to leave people with the unresolved issue of a text, because the Bible does not put a nice, neat bow on every passage. And it is irresponsible of us to impose a resolution where one does not exist. Preach expositionally. So it's not a structure, it's an intent. So, and preach narratively. Preach narratively. Perhaps we connect better with story. I often wondered, why is it that people can sit through a 3-hour Marvel movie and barely make it through a 25-minute sermon? You know why? Marvel is telling a story. There's a story there. It's not all the special effects and the explosions and the fights. What people are engaged in is the story. It's the same reason every time The Godfather comes on, I'm watching it. Every time. 1 and 2. And because I'm a Godfather loyalist, I fuss and get upset when I have to watch Godfather 3. It's story. Story works. When Jesus got ready to teach masses, very rarely did he just give them bulleted points and principles. When he got ready to explain the kingdom of heaven, he said, you know what it's like? A sower had some seed, and he went out and put it on varying types of ground. It's like a net that pulls in all kinds. Who is my neighbor? Okay, let me tell you a story. There was a guy on his way from Jerusalem to Jericho. He got beat up, left half dead. If that's the communication style of the one we proclaim, perhaps it's not just for us to be descriptive, but it should be prescriptive for us. Preach socially. Preach socially. There is no way that we can live in the social upheaval and the culture in which we live and ignore. It is irresponsible to ignore the social realities of our day. Racial, economic issues of our day. It is irresponsible for us to do so. Intergenerational preaching requires stringing or pulling a thread through each generation to tie them together about how the gospel works socially. Because if the only thing Jesus was interested in was taking us to heaven, he would not have given us the Olivet Discourse, where the judgment of the nations is clearly stated to be done based on social factors. I was hungry and you didn't feed me. I was thirsty and you didn't give me water. I was in prison and you didn't come see me. Jesus' initial identifier in Luke 4 is when he takes the scroll of Isaiah and reads a list of social things he came to accomplish with his person and work. Liberty to the captive, sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are bruised. These are social realities, and we must not over-spiritualize Jesus' message and words. We have to preach authentically. Preaching to multiple generations requires cultural awareness. But in 1 Corinthians 9, when Paul says, I become all things to serve people, he is not saying he is inauthentic. Listen to him again, carefully say, I became as a Jew, as under the law, though not being under the law myself, as one outside the law, though under the law of Christ. He is still authentic. So I don't try to deny the generation I'm in order to reach the others. Because inauthenticity, a lack of authenticity, always turns people off. Phony doesn't work. It doesn't work. Be authentically yourself. It's Phillips Brooks' old definition of preaching when he gave the Lyman Beecher lectures: truth through personality. That's what God uses. Truth through personality. Preach illustratively. I don't think we can understate the importance of illustration in sermon. Sermon illustrations are perhaps the most effective means of communicating gospel point. Keith Battle would say that exegesis is like underwear. You should have it on, but we don't need to see it. And so use stories. Search for them. Collect them. Use them. They work in every generation. Preach doctrinally. Doctrine matters. Doctrine connects all generations. It means that what is beyond my preference is God's principle. It is the truth of Scripture as laid out in a systematic understanding of biblical theology. I went to a rather liberal seminary where they tried to tell us that we could have a systematic theology without a biblical one. But in the old words of the Pentecostal brothers and sisters, the devil is a liar. You need a firm biblical theology in order to have a systematic one. And people need to be able to connect varying passages of Scripture, varying truths of the testaments, etc., doctrinally. Then preach succinctly. Dr. Maurice Watson said, the art of 21st century preaching is the art of editing. And some of the greatest sermons come from putting phenomenal sentences, phrases, and paragraphs on the cutting room floor. Because in this age, clarity requires extreme editing. I'll give you an example from today. So, at the end of that sermon, when those chariots of horses and fire come, the idea is focus and determination to be focused. And a lot of people say that the fiery chariots and horses come so that they can take Elijah up to heaven, but that's not true. He doesn't go up in the fiery chariots and horses. He goes up in a whirlwind. So what are the fiery chariots and horses for? Verse 11 says the fiery chariots and horses come to separate them. Now that seems a bit extreme, doesn't it? It is a picture of Elisha's faithfulness. It is so strong to Elijah that God had to send heaven's armies to separate him. Now that's good. I like that. But the students had to get out. So it's got to go on the cutting room floor. Sermonic succinctness requires putting some great things on the cutting room floor. And here's what people will appreciate and return for. And here is what will make your preaching more effective intergenerationally through all the people groups, all those ages, all those stages, all of those educational levels. The preacher is not up here trying to prove how smart they are. They're trying to help me live. Help me know Christ. Help me to live like Christ. And in that way, being a responsible editor is also being a responsible preacher. That's all I got for you today. I hope it was helpful. All right. Questions, comments, disagreements? I'm not sensitive. I can handle it all. So.
You mentioned being succinct. How long is a typical sermon for you?
Oh, how long is it? Or how long am I trying to make it? I'd love to get, I'm trying to get to like 22 minutes. I'm trying desperately. Oh, it's 30, 35, 30, 35. And I blame them. I say, if you all said amen more, but y'all making me explain because you don't act like you understand. But yeah, I'd like to be around 22 minutes, and it's possible. I think there are some very effective preachers. Craig Oliver in Atlanta, Dr. Craig Oliver at Elizabeth Baptist Church in Atlanta, is an extremely effective, clear, and faithful preacher in 22 minutes, 22 to 25 minutes when he goes long. So it's possible to do so. Those of us who, again, read and venerate and celebrate the oratory gifts of some of the preachers of the past and even the present, we like to pontificate a little bit. And it doesn't help when you're around other preachers and they're like, yes, sir, because we like that stuff. And it's not a matter of being brief for just the sake of being brief. I mean, what we didn't get to talk about is the attention span of the pew is very, very different. I remember when Gary McIntosh put out Finding Them, Keeping Them. Y'all remember that book? And he talked about how the attention span of the pew was 7-minute segments because they were trained to watch 30-minute sitcoms where there's 7 minutes and then commercials and then 7 minutes and commercials and then final 7 minutes. Well, it is even worse today. That preceded social media. That preceded Twitter and Facebook and Vine, which was purchased and done away with, but Vine could tell a full story in 6 seconds. Vine gave you 6 seconds, and people gave a full story in 6 seconds visually. And social media is rewiring our brains also. It rewires the brain. It is one, we're all addicted to it. Those of us who are on it, we're addicted to it. And then it doesn't just affect the attention span, it affects our pleasure centers. So the same endorphins that are released during moments of physical ecstasy are released when we get likes and follows, the science is saying. And so that shapes our preaching, or should shape our thinking about preaching in very different ways. Yeah. I'd like to be 22 minutes to answer the question. Yeah. Questions, comments, disagreements?
How is preaching trending? Where is it going?
Yeah, where's preaching going? I think, so in a general sense, what I'm finding is that there is a tendency to connect with sermons with the masses of people who listen to preaching regularly, tend to connect with sermons that are subjective, that are me-centered. It's harder to engage people with a Christocentric sermon. And I don't think that's ground we need to surrender for the sake of engagement. I think we have to constantly fight for space in hearts and minds that is Christ-centered and not self-centered. But what seems to be more popular is individualism, this strange blending of New Ageism. You know, I preach, fuss at my people all the time about, this use of energy and vibes and karma that was reintroduced into our consciousness through that book, The Secret, and then Oprah Winfrey promoted it and its author. And so people started doing, and it's not inherently bad, people started doing vision boards, and not understanding the origin of that, people started talking to the universe about the universe as though it was God. The universe, wants you to have it, and if you wish for it, and if you, speak it, those kinds of things. It's New Ageism. It's individual-centered, and that seems to be where preaching is going. But we have to fight for the consciousness, and therefore conscience of the pew, to say not about you, not what you want, not the life you dream of. And then some very, very popular voices promote those self-centered sermons, and not necessarily Christocentric sermons. So that's where it seems to be, and where it seems to be trending right now. But we got to pull back in the tug of war against it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Do you have multiple services on Sunday morning?
We do 3 services, 8, 10, and 11:30, and each of those services are very, very, very different personalities at St. Mark. So my 8 o'clock church is Baptist. I can sing a hymn, and they know the hymn. They're going to Sunday school afterwards. I preach at St. Mark 8 o'clock, and there's a familiarity with the Bible. It's my favorite preaching service, is 8 o'clock. 10 o'clock is like Episcopalian church. There's no response in any way. There's no, they're quiet. But they are the ones who are bringing their friends, and they're, and it's only an hour. It's 55 minutes, and they come late, get the sermon, and then leave. So they really get about 35 minutes of church, maybe. And then 11:30 is like almost Pentecostal. They like to cry and fall out and weep and wave and fan and all that stuff. WWF, weep and wave and fan. And they like to, they want the choir to sing all day. They just, and they're the young kind of single crowd, and they need to come in and cry and tell God how sorry they are about what they did Saturday night. So that's my 11:30 service. My boomers are at 8 o'clock, and then I've got, if I were to categorize them, I'd say boomers at 8, and of course there are exceptions. My group, Generation X, and some older millennials at 10, and then a lot of Xers and Zs at 11:30. But then I got some boomers who like all the noise at 11:30, and then 8 o'clock. So 8 o'clock doesn't mind me preaching 45 minutes. They want it all. When I'm on time, when I'm on my schedule, and I'm 25 minutes, 8 o'clock is like, Pastor, you left some stuff off of that. I want all of the sermon. They want all of it. But 11:30, when I get to minute like 17, 18, they're like, all right, you've been up here a whole 15 minutes, so they just don't have the attention span for it.
Would you characterize that to being in the Midwest as opposed to?
So I'm in the mid-south, so Arkansas. I think it's some of that, but I've had the privilege of going to preach across the country. I think it's generational more than geographical. Yeah, I think that's more generational than geographical. As I talk to colleagues, it seems like that's kind of their, people with multiple services, that first service is going to be probably the best preaching service in terms of people who and what they want, yeah.
When you talk about this new age and having the 3 services as a dialogue with different pastors across the country, do you have a difficulty communicating that message in those 3? When you try to get something unified?
Well, so so I preach the same thing at every service, but everybody might not. I may alter the introduction. I may alter illustrations. I may alter the tone and the pace and all of those things for the service. So I have to do a lot of explaining, what I feel like is a lot of explaining at 11:30. So 11:30 gets a different pace they get different illustrations because they're not as biblically literate as 8 o'clock, and maybe even sometimes as 10. So there are differences, different nuances among those, but they're getting the same sermon. Yeah, for the most part. Yeah, Ivy, what you?
What is the sermon process like?
Preparation process? Oh, it depends on the week and the day. So I start, this is terrible. This is a terrible habit. But I start, especially when I'm in a series, I still preach through books of the Bible. I'm in Nehemiah now, full books. Last year we preached through Romans, Colossians. I preached through books. I don't think that's passe at all. In fact, for younger generations, I think it's even more necessary. But I start on Sunday when I'm done with the third service. I go to the office and then into my library, and I start, and that's a terrible habit. But I can't quite rest without at least having the proposition for the next week. And then I'm doing the heavy lifting of exegetical work, sometimes Sunday, Monday evening, Tuesday, and then I'm writing sermon, shaping sermon Tuesday afternoon, and it's never finished to me. And that's another bad habit. So I start too soon and I work too long. But I'm going to start with reading it many times, many translations, over and over and over again to get a sense of it. I'm going to put the emphasis on different words. I'm going to deal with language issues and look and see if there are textual variations and who I trust within a passage to give, if there are variations in terms of manuscripts, who I think gives the best evidence about which manuscript is reliable on that passage. I'm going to look at some exegetical commentaries to start my writing process. But of course, I'm not going to look at a homiletical commentary until I'm done. Get that proposition, shape that sermon, tone, length, etc. Then I'm going to look at some homiletical commentaries to see, am I in line? Am I agreeing? People I trust. And then shaping illustrations and such is the very kind of last thing, generally speaking, for me. So a traditional process, but then sometimes it just works out another way. Sometimes structure just appears in a text. Some texts just look like they have 4 clear movements just on their face. And it's just, it's just there. So nothing you can do about it. You just preach it as it is. Yeah. So that's kind of my process. Yeah. Yes.
So you talked about the need for community and the body of Christ, and with the easy accessibility online sermons and podcasts, I know at least in my generation, you get the excuse of I don't need church, I'll just watch it at home.
Mm-hmm.
You're still getting Bible intake.
Yeah.
How do we convince people of the need of that in-person community of the body of Christ?
I think and we're wrestling with that at our church. I think most churches are wrestling with that idea. I think it requires, there has to be some invitation to community. What I've discovered is that people will be involved if they're invited, and not necessarily get involved if they feel obligated. So the idea is that you have a small group or a small Bible study that's a part of the larger ministry of the church, and you just personally go out and invite them, and that's what we try to encourage our people to do. Invite others to the group, tell them I'm looking for you Sunday, let's hang out, you know what I mean? Or you say, hey, let's go to brunch Sunday. Yeah, well, meet me at church. You know what I mean? So that personal invitation seems to be more engaging, and we're seeing some success with people coming to engage the corporate worship experience based on personal invitation. I think we've preached about it. I think we've tried to write books and do lessons on it, but it's got that. I think that's the way. It's got to be the 1-to-1, 2-to-1 peer pressure kind of feel to get people engaged in community. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What do you take to the pulpit?
This. Yeah, yeah. So I love my preaching when I'm reading a manuscript, but nobody else does. So I generally have my kind of scratch notes on my phone, and I take my Bible, and that's what I'm using. But I'm reading my sermon in my mind. I'm reading it like I'm reading a piece of paper when I'm preaching. And it's very strange and weird. My mother dropped me on my head when I was little, and so that's just how my brain works. But I would love to take a full manuscript up there and read it, and I'm like, this is good here, yeah. And the rest of the church is like, we don't know what you're talking about. So I'm less engaging on a full manuscript. But some others are not. My doctoral mentor, William Curtis, is a full manuscript preacher, and he is amazing at it. H. Beecher Hicks is going to stand up there and read his manuscript. Pastor Emeritus of Metropolitan Baptist in D.C., he's going to read a manuscript, and it's amazing. They can do it, and people find it engaging and helpful, but I'm just not one who can get away with it. So this is my, yeah. I'd write a mental manuscript, if that makes sense. Yeah, yeah.
So I know you plan your preaching annually. Are there some target areas you're trying to hit as you're leading the church to preach?
Yeah, so I plan my preaching generally, I start generally in July for the next year, and then I have a group of friends, and we go away generally after Thanksgiving to do a full sermon plan for the next year. Areas I want to hit in some way, and these are not unique to me. These are from my pastor, John Jenkins. So I want to talk about stewardship in some way. I want to talk about evangelism in some way to remind people of the Great Commission. Stewardship, evangelism, I want to ensure that people are addressing marriage and family, social responsibility. So those are what I've found for me is that preaching through books of the Bible, you get to hit them, and you don't. It's not like it's a pet issue. I'm preaching through this book, and here's a marriage and family sermon. So I'm in Nehemiah now. Get to Nehemiah 13. Where they divorced their wives that they married in Babylon, which is an overreach, an overcorrection. Bible is replete with God's heart for marriage, and the Bible is clear about how God has used what they would call, or they considered, mixed marriages. The lineage of the Lord Jesus Christ has Gentile women involved in it, and so what does it look like when we establish a sense of purity that doesn't reflect the heart of God? And then I get to talk about marriage without trying to make it a marriage issue. You know what I mean? So that's, I think there are themes that I want to hit, but if you preach expositionally through the Bible, you get to hit those themes. Yeah. Hillstock, you had your hand. You good? Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Who's your favorite preacher? Well, that's probably your dad.
It is, yeah.
Who do you like to listen to? If you to pull up a sermon right now, who would you go to?
I listen to my friends, man. Charles Edward Goodman Jr., Tabernacle Baptist in Augusta, Georgia. Antoine Hutchins from Christian Unity Baptist in Waldorf, Maryland. George Parks Jr., who pastors New Hope in North Little Rock. I listen to those guys consistently. They encourage my heart. Kenneth Riolan Jr. He's actually in transition to Paramount Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. At this point. I like to listen to them. I like to listen to Dr. Curtis, my doctoral mentor. Those persons who are responsible, clear, faithful, creative, preaching. I like preaching that makes me think like two things. One, I must not really be called, because I can't do that. And two, I need to go buy a lot more books, because I didn't know that. That's the kind of preaching I love. Make me question my call and make me go to the library. And those guys do it. They do it to me. Yeah, absolutely. They're just an incredible number of preachers. God has preachers everywhere. Charlie Dates, he sickens me. I listen to Charlie and I physically get sick. I'm like, why? Romeo Williams, who just came a couple weeks ago, we call each other twin brother. Those guys, they are doing it, and I listen to them and I get discouraged and encouraged at the same time. Yeah.
This is a real serious question here. Are you calling the hogs yet?
See, I'm from the East Coast, so
You got to be from Arkansas to understand.
yeah, I'm from the East Coast, so I'm a University of Maryland fan, but I don't follow them anymore because they're in the Big Ten rather than the ACC. So I can't quite root for Maryland against Ohio State and Wisconsin. That doesn't feel right to me. It feels like an abomination. They're supposed to play Duke and Clemson, and that's who Maryland should be playing. But no, so when they changed conferences, it just threw off my whole piece. But I'm rooting for Baylor now because my daughter's there. So I'm a Baylor Bears guy in the interim until Maryland wises up and goes back to the ACC.
And it's evident God forgave them because they got to get reverend.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
With all of your preaching responsibilities, what does your devotional life look like?
That's good. What does it look like? I love the Valley of Vision, those Puritan prayers. I'm a poet I'm not a poet. I like poetry. I'm a poetry addict, let me say. And I just like the way those Puritan prayers read. I pray them. I have notes. I have one of the leather-bound copies. I have notes and scriptures in them that provide study fodder for me. But I'm generally using what I'm preaching through as my devotion. So my friends call me crazy for this, but so with preaching through like Nehemiah, I read not the passage I'm preaching, I read the book of Nehemiah probably daily. If I don't read the whole book, I'm reading most of it. One of the great tools that technology gives us is the ability to engage the Bible as it was intended, which it's my sense that the Bible wasn't mostly written to be read as much as it was written to be heard, because it was written to generally illiterate cultures, and some of those books are records to be kept on file, chronicles and such. But most of it is written to be heard. And so you get the Bible app and you listen to it. And man, listening to it is another experience than reading it. And so I'll read through it and I'll listen to it, generally listen to it every day. Which helps me when I'm preaching a particular passage, it helps me to keep in mind the theme, tone, and structure of the whole book so that I don't pull that passage in isolation and bastardize it, It helps in that way. So that's my devotional life for the most part. So Valley of Vision, and then what I'm preaching through, I'm going to probably read through. A couple times a year, I'm going to do 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus devotionally to maintain my sense of pastoral responsibility. And those books are encouraging and frightening and weighty if you take pastoral ministry seriously. So, yeah. Anything? And I generally do them together. So 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, like when I say I read through a book, I'll read all of them together or listen to them together to get the fullness of it. Okay?
Do you have a favorite book in the Bible?
That has changed. I think Romans, if God had only given us Romans, we could still make it to heaven. I think so. I think Romans is, yeah.
Pointer, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.